Good morning. I'm Robbie, and we're going to start today with Julie lighting our chalice and doing our chalice.
New energy. This is from Carrie Chapman Catt. To the wrong that need resistance, to the right that needs assistance, to the future in the distance, give yourself.
So, as a reminder, this is being recorded, but it will stop during joys and concerns. So, we're a lay-led community, strengthened and enriched by weaving together the volunteer contributions of friends and members. Our community is supported and guided by our minister, Victoria Coleman, and also supported by our technicians and our admin person. If you're new, I'm not sure I see anybody who's totally new today. We have some people who are relatively new and have name tags this time for the first time. Yay, that's wonderful. Yeah. And we'd like to welcome back Jim, who hasn't been with us for a while. Thank you. We are clear in our desire to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Wabash Coast Salish Native people. The Puyallup and Muckleshoot people have lived on and stewarded these lands since the beginning of time and continue to do so today. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is just one small step towards true allyship, and we commit to uplifting the voices, experiences, and histories of the indigenous people of this land and beyond, and to working with and for social justice for indigenous peoples. As we settle in, we acknowledge that our congregation is committed to individual freedom of belief, welcomes diversity, seeks to promote the sense of community, works for social justice, and fosters religion, which enriches our spirit. Whoever you are, whomever you love, however you arrived here, you belong. Please repeat after me. It is good.
It is good.
It is good to be.
It is good to be.
It is good to be here together.
It is good to be here together.
I will do a formal introduction of our speaker in a while, but I wanted to welcome Bruce Holman, who is our speaker for today and is sitting right there, there he is, back there. As you know, that I think probably the name of our service today and our theme is What's in a Name. And Kim, who can't be here today because of family commitments, has works with Dr. Holman at the Historical Society and Historical Museum, and arranged for him to come because of his expertise in many areas related to this. So we look forward to having that. And just a reminder that at the end of the service, we will be breaking for some lovely stuff. Thank you very much to the hospitality community, to Earl for organizing that, and a couple of people for bringing. Jeff, you made the homemade bread? You do, and we have homemade scones. It's quite a feast. So, but then we're going to reconvene to have a very important discussion about names, our name as we go forward. So I request and encourage all of you to stay for a while afterwards to join us for that. Our opening reading is by Mary.
Here, by Reverend David Frieden. When it feels like lament is the only sound, and need is the only way of being. Here is the one warm room where you belong. Here is the room you know is waiting, open, ready. Here is the place where you are known and remembered in this too cold world. This place calls now softly. Come into the circle where you know you belong.
Thanks, Mary. And our opening song is number 44 in your blue-gray handbook. Thanks, Leslie. We're so delighted to have Leslie back again to do our music.
Play it once through. We're going to play it once through before we sing. Number 44.
That's a beautiful song, and I look forward to having her sing it again. That's lovely. Spring, we have to make the most of it while we're here. So our speaker, as I said, is Dr. Bruce Holman, and many of you are already familiar with Bruce. He's a longtime member and core, I think, in a lot of ways of the Vashon community. A number of things about him. He's a historian, and for over 23 years he worked on developing a history of Vashon, which, along with Gene Finley, was published. And I'm sure I've seen the book. I've looked at it for sure, and many of you have as well. The Natural and Human History of Nyland. He taught for many years at the Evergreen College and continues to host a study abroad semester in Australia and New Zealand every year. And when I was asking, what he thought about his background was particularly relevant to what we were doing, he said this, which I thought was really interesting, and I appreciated that there's a lot of similarities between those societies and ours, and that they were like our origins. They were colonized by European countries, and and all that goes along with that in terms of what happens to people who have been not acknowledged and kind of to really struggle to kind of keep their identity and their place in society. He is currently the president of the board of the Vashon Historical Society. I love this one. He's the founder of the sailing program. I live in Burton, and I keep walking by that little plaque that says, I think it says Bruce Holman Youth Sailing Program, and thinking, what is that? So it's a program to help our youth learn to do that. What a wonderful thing. Sailing is such a freeing experience. So that was another one. He also writes a column called Time and Again in the Beachcomber. Vashon every week, which is a really amazing. And this week, I think in particular, the speaker is the CEO, the president, whatever she calls herself, of Seattle Indian Health Board, and is going to be talking about their project here. So when is that, Bruce?
Tuesday, 11 a.m. voice session.
Yeah, so I mean, that would be like, be amongst the first to hear, you know, what it is that's going to be happening here on Vashon for that. One of the other things that I liked in just reading that was a past Beachcomber article, actually, was that your living room is full of masks that you carved yourself. Welcome.
I feel at home.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sheila. Sheila Brown's husband, Brian Brown, is the one who started Brown briefly, and even though he's in hopefully greener fields.
And he used to be a member here.
He did, yes, very much so, yeah. And a really great guy. And so we've tried to keep his tradition going with Brown briefly, and we do what we can. You know, nobody can quite do it. Oh, yeah, nobody can quite do it with the same kind of humor and seriousness that Brian did, but we try. Thank you. Well, and I'm here because Kim Kambach convinced me to come, and then she sort of chickened out, and she's down on Oregon Coast with her grandkids, so I'm stuck. But that happens, right? You know, the topic here is what's in a name, you know, and it's sort of, that's not really my expertise as a historian. But as I was talking with Wabi, you know, for almost 25 years, I've done a study abroad program in Australia and New Zealand. You know, I'm down there every January, February, March, which is a good place to be because the summer there when it's like this here. But it's really fascinating to sort of see the intersection between Aboriginal Indigenous people in Australia and New Zealand and here in the United States. And there's striking similarities. There's also striking differences. And so anytime, I'd be happy to come back sometime and talk about Australia, New Zealand, and Indigenous people. Because you have three British settler societies that are very similar, three sort of constitutional democracies that are very similar in many ways, three sort of colonizations of Indigenous people that take very different sort of approaches to how to deal with Indigenous people. And so it's a fascinating sort of thing to me, at least. So if you're desperate for somebody sometime, it's something I've been working on. So what I want to do is talk about what's in a name and focus mainly on Vashon, because that's what I know best. And it's sort of, you know, there's lots of different ways to look at what names mean and how names sort of are derived and that kind of thing. And one is sort of the linguistic or etymological sort of side of it. And I'm assuming a lot of you read the New Yorker. Can I assume that?
Yeah.
which is, to me, it's a, you know, I grew up on the East Coast. I've been out here. I've been on Vashon 50 years this year. So I moved here 50 years ago. But there was an article, maybe a month and a half ago, by Manveer Singh called You First. And what he was doing is looking at the term indigenous and how that term sort of evolved. And the fact that names like, and words like indigenous are, they evolve, they're fluid, they change. Indigenous, of course, has its roots in a Latin term, indigene, which means native or sprung from the land. And it was used for flora and fauna, but in 1588, it was first used to apply to people. And so with it comes a whole set of sort of assumptions about what a word like indigenous means. And coming out of that sort of flora and fauna sort of side of it, it has this kind of connotation of wilderness, of being detached from history, being detached from civilization. And so we bring those kind of the colonizers who begin to call people indigenous people bring with it that link between indigenous as a word, between native, what that means, between primitive, and draw a line between themselves as colonizers and the people they colonize as the colonized. And so it's interesting to think how words begin to hold power, if you will. And in many ways, a word like indigenous tends to freeze the past. We don't see Native Americans, Maori, Aboriginal people. We carry around in our head these images of them as at a fixed point of time. And yet, they change, those societies change, those languages change, those cultural practices change just as much as ours do. And yet, by imposing a name, you impose a worldview, in fact. So that's where I want to sort of start with. And then there's also the spiritual dimension. Genesis 2:20, naming all the animals, and the plants and all that. And that sort of brings up this kind of concept of sort of when you use a name, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to create dominion? Are you creating responsibility? Are you creating this concept of usufruct, where you use it but don't necessarily return to it? And so it's an interesting sort of intersection, if you will, of what words mean. Is Melvin here?
Yes.
There you are, Melvin. I met him just briefly. I read, Kim sent me the piece you did maybe a month or so ago on the name process and this organization looking at what you're going to call yourselves, basically. And so I thought it was a very thoughtful piece, Melvin. And what was interesting is where you started. Are we going to call ourselves Vashon, whatever? Are we going to call ourselves Vashon Maori, whatever? And it's interesting because the names Vashon and Maori have very different origins and have a sort of a built-in conflict, if you will. Vashon, interestingly enough, first named by George Vancouver, 1792, and he's here in May. He anchors his boat off the south end of Bainbridge Island, and they send boats all around Puget Sound. Peter Puget, of course, leads the one that goes down in the South Sound, and we get Puget Sound from that. But he names the island Vashon's Island, Vashon with an apostrophe. And that stayed in use for almost 50, 60 years until you begin to get waves of American and Euro-American settlers coming into the area. And then they very quickly dropped the apostrophe S. But we all know what apostrophe S means, right? It's mine. I own it, which is the whole concept of naming. And that's why when Vancouver comes into Puget Sound, he begins to name things. Mount Baker, Mount Rainier, just go down the list, Vashon's Island, all those things, Bainbridge Island, Whidbey Island. I mean, all these places are named in the sense that then Britain has a claim to the area. Well, almost 50 years later, Charles Wilkes, the American exploring expedition, comes into Puget Sound. And what does Wilkes do? He names everything that Vancouver didn't name. and he decides that Maury Island is a separate island from Vashon Island. So he names it Maury Island after Lieutenant William Maury, one of the officers in his expedition. And of course, the issue with Maury Island is of course, William Maury was from Virginia. He was a slave owner. He resigned his American Naval Commission, was commissioned as an officer in the Confederate Navy, served to develop defenses for harbors, eventually went to England and helped sort of arm a raider called the CSS, Confederacy ship Georgia, which was one of the most successful Confederate raiders in the Atlantic. And then at the end of the war, he was commanding ironclad battleships that were defending Charleston Harbor. And so the controversy is, do we want an island that we're associated with, whether we live on Maury or not, with an enslaver? And that's an issue that's going on all over the country right now. And my friend Stephen McDonald has come up with I think, an ingenious solution for that. And he's written about it some. He has researched the Maury name and found a distant cousin to William Maury, who was named Antonia Maury, a woman who was one of the first women astronomers in the United States, worked at Harvard University, and was the person responsible. Also, she didn't get credit for it. Sort of like the women who calculated the landing on the moon. They did all the work, but didn't get any of the credit. She actually developed the sort of designation of star brightness that we use to sort of designate stars. So his solution is what I call the King County solution. No, King County, originally named for Rufus King, who was a senator elected to be vice president, died before he was sworn into office, from the South, a slave owner. King County changed the name from Rufus King to Martin Luther King, but it's still King County. They changed the logo, but they didn't change the name. And that's Steve's sort of approach to New York. Why don't we change who we're naming it after, but not change the name? So something to think about. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk, a couple of things I want to do. I want to talk just a little bit about the native people names for Vashon Island. We've not been able to find a single name designating Vashon Island that were used by the Squabosh people of Vashon. The Squabosh were a subgroup of what is now the Puyallup tribe. So there were Squabosh people here on Vashon Island, Gig Harbor, often called the Swiftwater people. That's how it translates. I think you guys have one of the yard signs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So good on you. But the Squabosh people, the Puyallup Mamish, who were at the mouth of the Puyallup River, another group up around where the town of Puyallup is, another group further up the river about where Eatonville is, were all pushed together by the Americans after the Treaty of Medicine Creek, put on one reservation and given one name. And that happened all over the West as American expansion took place, where tribal groups were put together, often, sometimes conflicting tribal groups were put together into reservations and given one name. And of course, the concept of tribe itself is a European construct that was brought by Americans and imposed on these cultures that had very fluid kinds of relationships between villages and between families and intermarriage. And so it gets complex and it gets nuanced as you move into it. But the Squabosh, and let's have a little pronunciation lesson if we can. It's you know the investment firm Charles Schwab, right? So it sort of starts like that. It's a soft S, Schwab, and then Schwa, you say Schwa, and then Bob, B-A-B, Bob, and then it ends with a like this. Squabosh. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Squabosh. Okay, practice. You'll get on it, right? If you're interested, and there's copies, I think, at the King County Library here on the island and at the Heritage Museum. A number of people have copies of it, and I think they're available online if you want. But there's a guy named T.T. Waterman, who was an anthropologist, really interesting early anthropologist, when anthropology was just emerging as a discipline. And he taught at the University of Washington between 1918 and 1920. And he began what he called the geography of Puget Sound, native place names all over Puget Sound. And in the late 1990s, Vi Hilbert, who was one of the sort of leading voices in restoring the Chukchi Coast Salish language, along with Zamir Zahai, one of her students, and let's see, who was the other person? Jay Miller, an anthropologist, I think the University of British Columbia, took Waterman's work, sort of pulled it together, annotated it, and published it as a geography of Puget Sound. And for Vashon Island, there's 36 distinct Coast Salish names on Vashon Island. And what's interesting about that is, in all of that, there's no one single name for the island. And in talking with Brandon Raynon, the historian and anthropologist of the Puyallup tribe and the cultural affairs and the language people, they sort of think, as I do, that people didn't see the island as a separate place. I mean, these were people of the water. I mean, they moved from Gig Harbor to Quartermaster Harbor to Commencement Bay, down through the Narrows, up to Blake Island. They moved around, and it was the places along the water that were important, not the islands, because they didn't see them as separate from the mainland, and separate from the rivers. And so we just don't have, I think, a real name for Vashon Island from Coast Salish language. But there's 36, and if you're interested, it's interesting pointing that out, because everything from sort of Dilworth south around Maury Island into Quartermaster Harbor, and then around up to Peter Point, there are names for many of those places. There were, I think, 8 village sites in Quartermaster Harbor, and numerous sort of family gathering sites around the island, and very few names in the interior of the island. Most of the names are around the waterfront, the coast of the island, as you would expect. Although pretty clear evidence from the very first survey in 1856, where they came through and they sort of mapped out every square mile of the island, created that sort of Northwest Territories kind of mapping system, designated townships and all that kind of stuff. And they wrote detailed notes about what they found in each square mile on Vashon. And there's fairly detailed notes about areas that were purposely burned, so that Native people obviously went into the center of the island, kept open areas at the time were called swales, or what we would call meadows, to keep them open so that you could get bracken fern and other kinds of plants growing that could be harvested. Not the kind of agriculture that Vancouver or Wilkes would have recognized as agriculture, but kind of fire stick agriculture, if you will. And of course, for the Native people of Vashon Island, the problem was carbohydrates. You have a tremendously rich protein diet. All you have to do is walk down to the beach and dig clams or get mussels or fish or herring or whatever. Lots and lots of protein, but not much carbohydrate. And so there's actually an oak tree on the Burton Peninsula that probably, and we've measured it, it's probably at least 150 to 250 years old. So it's not, it's been there a long time. And it's a tree that doesn't naturally occur north of sort of the Fort Lewis area. And so it was either a volunteer brought in by a bird or something like that, or purposely planted. But those acorns were harvested, ground, soaked in salt water to get the tannins out, and then used as a kind of flour. Same thing with bracken ferns. I mean, there's a number of ways that you can get carbohydrates in an agricultural, sort of a fire stick agriculture, that you can't easily get anywhere else. So they huge amounts of protein, but how do you get the carbohydrates? And so some of that mapping shows that happened. So you have all of that, and I really, it's worth going back and looking at the Waterman book and just sort of seeing where these places are and what these names are and what the names represent. And then let me just talk about some Vashon names. And what I tried to do is break it down to, I mean, as a historian, you sort of build categories, right? That's the way, one of the ways we understand the world. And so, there's some very practical names on Vashon Island, you know, like Center. You know, Center was going to be the center of the island. It was going to be the big business district on Vashon. Of course, that never happened, but it is sort of geographically in the center of the island. KVI Beach. I assume many of you go to KVI Beach. You know, it's Point Higher officially, but we all know it as KVI Beach because that's sort of a colloquial kind of name for it. Vashon Heights, that's one of the highest points on the island. Highest point's actually down toward Tahlequah, but when you're coming down the Sound, you know, Vashon Heights is very visible. And that sort of hard sort of knob that sits up above Lake Highland, very visible as you come down the Sound. And of course, things like Cemetery Road, you know, cemetery, there's a cemetery, right? Yeah, go figure, it's easy to do. There's also lots of names on the island that are promotional. You know, Chautauqua itself, now Ellisport, was basically a Chautauqua gathering site, and it was a Chautauqua assembly grounds. Tahlequah itself, you know, actually an Oklahoma Indian name that was named by the daughter of the people who owned the Burton store in a contest in 1920. The Tacoma Chamber of Commerce wanted a name that was more evocative than Clam Cove, which was the original name of Tahlequah. And so they held this contest, and this girl looking through whatever found the name Tahlequah, which at the time people thought meant water view from Cherokee language. And so she submitted, and she won a $50 prize, which in 1920 was kind of a prize, right? But so Tahlequah becomes this Native American name from Oklahoma that's transported to the Pacific Northwest. You know, Keplo Beach. Probably haven't heard of Keplo Beach, have you? No, because it's Klahani. And it was renamed in the 1920s because Klahani is a small resort, and Klahani in Chinook jargon means outside or outdoors. So that's sort of promotional kind of side of it. Swastika Lodge. We had a Swastika Lodge on Vashon Island, built in the late 1910s, early 1920s. Massive stone fireplace, and right in the middle of the fireplace was a swastika. But in 1920, a swastika meant very different things than it did 10 years later in the 1930s after the rise of Nazism in Germany. And then all of a sudden, the swastika takes on this very different connotation, very different meaning than it did in the 1920s when they were trying to promote this place as sort of tied to Native culture, tied to the four seasons, the four winds, all the kinds of things that a swastika in ancient cultures meant, but then get subsumed by this Nazi Germany sort of approach.
What happened to it?
I'm sorry?
What happened
It
to it?
actually burned down in the early 1960s. If you know where Shanahan Road is, Pam Ingalls, I think, lives along Shanahan Road. Stephen Silla just recently moved to Tacoma from Shanahan Road. It's this little road that comes off of Dilworth Road and just runs right along the bluff there. That's where Swastika Lodge. So just a little bit to the east of Dilworth. And of course, Gold Beach, you know, the development of Gold Beach, you know, sort of not clear whether Dom Spano named it after Gold Beach in Oregon, where he used to vacation a lot, or the fantasy that there was gold in the soil there. And, you know, and of course, the properties are now solid gold for us, right? So, you know, sort of that kind of thing. North Hilla, down at the end of Maury Island, was actually named after the Norton Hill Company, which was the property developers in Tacoma who sort of developed it. Patton's Palisades at the north end, you know, John Patton, who sort of developed that. So you get these promotional kinds of names. So as you're thinking, are you trying to promote yourself or not? Then there's also the quirky names like Vashon. Aquarium. Most of you haven't heard of Aquarium probably, but it was one of the first post offices on Vashon Island. If you go to a marine chart of Puget Sound, aquariums still on the marine charts because they were first developed in the 1880s and 1890s. An aquarium is still on there. It's about where Winghaven Park is. Okay. But named Aquarium because the first postmaster there was a retired sea captain named Fish. So, okay, we'll just name it Aquarium. And Liza Beulah, the only town in the United States named Liza Beulah. It's right here on Vashon Island. And it's, you know, several different stories about how it might have emerged, but it seems to be Marjorie Stanley, an early island historian, you know, a librarian from the 1940s into the 1960s at the Vashon Library. She recounts that it was named by a postmaster named Butt after his two daughters. He had one daughter named Elizabeth that they called Eliza. And so he just dropped the E, and then another daughter named Beulah, and it's the two names together and it becomes Liza Beulah. No other Liza Beulahs in the world that I've been able to find. So, and then you have Frog Holler. You know, if you drive down Wax Orchard Road, you go by Frog Holler. And that was named by Mike Bradley in the mid-1980s just to designate that neighborhood. It used to be called Southern Heights, and it was actually a school there just south of where Camp Self is along Wax Orchard Road. So again, you get these kind of quirky things. And then you have Melita, which is over near the golf course, and that was actually a combination of Miles and Lewis and Tamara Hatch. And Miles Hatch is one of the people who founded Burton, you know, built the church, built the college, built the first store in Burton, so kind of the early sort of promoter and developer of Vashon and of Burton. He bought a farm over on Maury Island, and it was going to be a dairy farm, and they named it Melita. So they just took the first initials of his name, of his son Lewis, and of his wife Tamara, and called it Melita. Same thing with Margecera Inn down at Magnolia. You know? So Margecera, it was Marjorie was the mom, Jessie was the daughter, and Ira was the dad. And so they just put those names together to create Margecera Inn. So you can go that quirky direction if you want. And then there's nostalgic names. Burton itself, pretty obviously named. There's a couple references from Miles Hatch, who was born and grew up in Burton Township, Indiana, or Illinois, I'm sorry, Illinois. Was one of the first graduates. He was among the first graduating class at the University of Illinois. His father had come out, made a fortune in the gold rush, had bought businesses in Tacoma, and they sent Miles out here to sort of run those businesses. Miles stumbles onto Quartermaster Harbor, thinks, wow, this is a great place for a new town, and so he becomes the founder of Burton, if you will. And that's another interesting story. I can go on for a long time. One of you guys have a hook, right? You'll just drag you off. But yeah. What's fascinating to me about Miles Hatch is he really saw Burton being the commercial center of Vashon Island, and it was going to be until, you know, Vashon begins to emerge as a town. They build a road to the north end. Seattle begins to transplant Tacoma as the important commercial center in the Puget Sound region. And Burton very quickly sort of dies away and becomes what it is today. I mean, a nice, small community, but it's not downtown Vashon. Not that downtown Vashon is downtown, but, you know, at the same time, it's that idea that this was going to be the commercial center. Vashon is the only island in Puget Sound where the major commercial center is not on the water. So think about that. Every place else, every other island, Bainbridge, Whidbey, San Juan, Orcas, all the major cities, sort of commercial centers, are right on the water. Vashon isn't. And why is that? It's because Burton was supposed to be that commercial center, but it got bypassed by Tacoma. Vermontville, you know, certainly people from Vermont settled up there, sort of behind where the Episcopal Church is, and named it Vermontville. Magnolia, Shawnee, people who first settled there, named it after Shawnee, named after the Shaw family, Magnolia after their home in the south, in magnolia trees, Wax Orchards Road, after August Wax and Wax Orchards, Agron Park, Harold Agron, a World War II combatant who died in a POW camp in the Philippines, and his family in his honor gave that land to the community of Vashon to be a park. And so it's basically a war memorial park, if you will. Biloxi on Vashon, it's sort of up near the north end, south Patton's Palisades, named by a woman from Biloxi, Mississippi, who just missed Mississippi. And so we have a Biloxi. Burma Road, veterans from World War II come back, and those who fought in the India sort of Chinese border region remember the Burma Road. And if you've been on either Burma Road, they're very similar. They're sort of like you take your life in your hands kind of roads. And then Dilworth itself. I mean, Dilworth is not the official name of that point. The official name is Beals Point. But it was settled by Reverend Dilworth early on, who had a ship built called the Hylas, which means the word. And he was basically a circuit rider. But rather than riding a horse, he took his boat around Puget Sound as an itinerant preacher. And so that's become the sort of generic name of that area. We call it Dilworth, even though officially it's Point Beals. And then you have the changeable nature of names. Fisher Pond on Bank Road was originally French's Ponds and has been renamed. Christensen Creek that runs down and comes out at Liza Beulah was originally Jod Creek, J-O-O-D Creek. Sort of confusing with Judd Creek, but gets renamed Christensen Creek. The Jesus Barn. You've been around enough to know where the Jesus Barn was. That was not the name of that barn. It was the Shermans. It was the Shermans farm and lumber mill there. Lost Lake actually has an official name, Lake Allura. Go into geological maps and place name maps, you'll find it. But we know it as Lost Lake because it's hidden down in this sort of rift, little rift valley there. You'll love this. I always love this one. Tramp Harbor. We all drive by Tramp Harbor all the time. Its original name was Von Trump Harbor. So we could have Trump Harbor right here. Thank goodness. Yeah, right. So in the 1890s, the Geological Name Board sort of took a look and were competing sort of maps. Some had Von Trump, some had Tramp. And they went with Tramp Harbor. Thank goodness for us. so thank the Geological Name Board. So I think what I'm trying to communicate is just a sense that names have power. Names come from a variety of places, and Vashon's just a good example of that. And any place you go, you'll find that. So as you consider your name, consider what you want to be. Consider who you want to be seen as by others who read that name and will take from it what they bring in their own minds to what those words mean, because words do have power. So I appreciate you having me here today. It's just great fun to do this kind of stuff. So thank you very much.
Oh, who knew? That's great. So let's take just a moment to think about what he said, not just the awesomeness of change and all the idiosyncrasies, but also what that might mean to us as we think later about our own name. And Leslie's going to play us a little contemplative music.
Thank you.
So, this is our time for sharing joys and concerns. As a caring community, we set aside time to share the joys and concerns of our members and our friends, honoring our common humanity and the sacred spirit within each one of us. We support each other in difficult times, and we celebrate our joys together. If you have a joy you would like to share, or a burden that might be eased by sharing it in community, you're invited to briefly share it. For those as members and friends of Vashon Island Unitarian Fellowship, soon to be renamed something, we commit to supporting ourselves, our institution, our work. Financial resources help us pay speakers and staff, support our social justice programs, and maintain our buildings. Please support VIUF with your pledges and offerings so that we can continue to be a vital community. Our fellowship also engages beyond our walls for peace, social, and economic justice, freedom of belief, and protection of our planet and its inhabitants. Once a month, we contribute a financial offering to a community organization that aligns with our values. And next week, our offering will go to support the work of the Washington Environmental Council on Earth Day. So if the ushers could pass the baskets, and while we do that, Mary Van Gemmer is going to come up and share with us a couple of reasons for you to support us generously with your pledge, which is coming soon. Is there ushers for the basket? Yes. Yes.
You might wonder why I'm here, although given the position where I am right now with the basket being passed this Sunday morning, but generally I'm here to get relaxed and refreshed and renewed every Sunday morning, to get inspired and consoled in any problems I might have, or in a calm atmosphere of lovely people and surrounded with soft armchairs. I like those armchairs. So by meeting and greeting you, sitting quietly and listening to our speakers, singing together with our wonderful musicians, including Leslie, who is a lovely harpist, by praying together, exchanging views over coffee and treats, being educated and inspired by people such as Bruce Coleman, and a variety of wonderful speakers that we have. I'd like to hear expressing differing thoughts expressed in a variety of ways and words, and visual methods too. We have some wonderful visual aspects to our services. So why do I keep coming? To meet and greet, sit and sing together, and I think you get the point. That's what I said. Yeah. So please pledge. And so our dedicated and fellow UUs can plan for all of us, and they need to have some indication of what they have to work with in that money angle. So we can sit and sing together, and back to my armchair. I'm going. Just pledge and participate, so we can plan.
Thank you, Mary.
Mary will now come up and do our closing words.
Changes by Reverend Dr. David Breeden. I don't know if he was a doctor or what. Yeah, he was. Okay.
He changed.
He got his doctorate in the last 30 minutes. It's the only constant in all that changes. It's the passing things. It is the passing of all things changes. It's the becoming of all. It is a parade, this change is. It is a dance, this change is. It is the river and the stepping that's never twice. It is the tragedy of all that was, this change is. It is the fear of all that is, this change is. It is the hope of what may be yet, this constant, this change, this ice to water, this day to eternity. Come to the river, step, step, step.
Thank you, Mary. For our closing song, Catherine and I were negotiating about, not negotiating, we were thinking, what could we possibly do that would kind of lead in? So we decided we were just going to kind of struggle along a little bit with This Land Is Our Land. So we don't have the words for it. Leslie will play it, and whatever you know of it, sing. If not, imagine. Yeah.
This land is your land, this land is our land. From down the mountains to your fire, from the redwood forest to the country farm. This land was made for you and me. As I went walking down the highway, I saw above me the little skyway.
We all got the idea. That was good. Julie, you come up and English our cellist.
This is my meditation on the theme for the month of resist. Resist the impulse to run. It's fear that drives you, not hate. Love your instinct to help. Trust it. Resistance isn't futile. It requires fuel. Find that fuel in the flame. Feed love the light. And when you have no flame, be the light.
Nice.
Really didn't want that.
I forgot to open. Here we go. That's the official closing. So now we have a time for brief announcements. And then after that, we are going to reconvene for a discussion about name change. So I know it's a long service. It's been wonderful. And just take this chance to do a little caffeine, a little sugar, and then hang with us. So, announcements, anyone?